think we're about at 11 o'clock, so we can go ahead and get started. Thanks for coming this morning. Why don't we start with a word of prayer? Most gracious Heavenly Father, we just thank you for the day. We ask that you open our hearts and our minds, that we might hear how we might become better neighbors. We also ask your blessings today and your healing powers with Linda as she recovers from a difficult surgery and recovery process, and just hope that she can be back in our midst sooner than later. We just ask your blessings in your son's name. Amen. So, as I mentioned last week, last summer, Brian sent out an email to a number of people saying that the seminary was going to be offering a course in migrant ministries. And I think because of the work that I was starting to do with Casa San Jose, I thought I would try and apply for the class. So originally they were only going to have about 40 students. I guess they had such a large demand that they increased it to 50. But there are 50 students who are enrolled in this class. And the 50 people actually come from all over the world. There are a number of people from the United States and the Midwest and out on the West Coast, and even in the border states that border Mexico, and on the East Coast, there's a lot of folks from the US. I would say maybe half the class, but the other half comes from Mexico, Guatemala, Costa Rica, Colombia, Venezuela, and there's even a couple of folks from Africa who participate. So it's a Zoom class. It's taught primarily by Hunter Farrell, who's a faculty member at the seminary, and it's work that he's kind of put together over his career. He actually lived, I think, in Colombia for some time as a fluent Spanish speaker. So he has a lot of connections between work that he's done going back and forth to Central America and the work that he does in the seminary. So anyway, they offered this course. We're halfway through our course. So we started in the end of September and went through the middle of December and finished that part. And we're starting back up again on Monday night and going through the middle of April. And we'll see, how things will adapt to sort of where we are now. So anyway, I just wanted to kind of share with you kind of what we have gone through in our first semester of our course and talk about that. It's really a lot of the historical and theological and biblical perspectives on immigration and working with migrants. So we want to start
Let's get this great screen. I think that should be here. Share it. Let me make a full screen for you. Let's see. Okay. I'll move this out of the way. There we go. Maybe I can just put that.
Yeah, I'll go back to the first.
Yeah, I'll minimize.
There we go. Okay.
There we go.
Yeah, let me just leave it up there.
Okay, sounds good. So the course is actually get a certificate for attending the course if you attend at least 80% of the classes. So they do take attendance
How often do you meet?
every Monday evening at 6:30 or 7:30, depending on daylight savings time or not daylight savings time, because the rest of the world doesn't use that. So when we switched, we had all the people in the United States had to adjust a different hour. So anyway, we started out by talking about the theology of neighbor, and you can't get a better example about talking about the theology of neighbor than Mr. Rogers. And they use this slide in particular. You may remember there was a couple of very famous episodes, one in 1969, and then another one 27 years later in 1996 with Officer Clemens. And Officer Clemens was a black, he was an actor portraying a black police officer. He may have actually been a black police officer in the city of Pittsburgh. And in 1969, it was a time when swimming pools were segregated in the city. And even though civil rights legislation had been passed in 1965, there were still places where blacks and whites were not welcome to swim together. So Mr. Rogers had on Officer Clemens and used a little pool to say, we're going to share a pool together. And at the end of that, they actually shared a towel together as well. And that was back in 1969. It turns out that Officer Clemens was actually also gay. And at the time, they did not want to talk about that. So when he brought Officer Clemens back in the 90s, they talked about his coming out and being gay. And they recreated the scene with the swimming pool. And in addition, that time in 1996, after they were done, rather than just sharing a towel, Mr. Rogers wiped his feet off like Jesus had done with the disciples. And so, anyway, for us, it was sort of the beginning of trying to understand, who is our neighbor? How do we want to treat our neighbor? And using this as an example to developing sort of a theological perspective about neighbor. So the next thing we did was we talked about, are we all not migrants? I'm curious here if anybody was born in Pittsburgh and let's just say your father and mother were both born in Pittsburgh. If you are, raise your hand. Okay. I think that's typical of most places, that you will find that in one way or another, we've all moved around for one reason or another. I don't know if people want to maybe share a little bit of their family story, to just say like where your parents or your grandparents came from, if you know some of that history. You can go further back if you would like, and maybe talk about the reasons why your family or your ancestors moved around from place to place. Anybody have something they would like to share about that?
Well, I'll just back up. Paul would be able to raise his hand because his grandparents and his parents were all from Pittsburgh and even went to Mount Lebanon High School. Wow. That's tight. My grandmother's ancestry is through Czechoslovakia.
On which side?
My maternal grandmother. On my mother's side, yeah, all on my mother's.
My paternal grandfather's family is from Bohemia, which was Czechoslovakia. My grandmother, paternal grandmother was French Canadian. My paternal grandfather and grandmother, their ancestors are from Ireland.
Hello.
Go ahead, I think it was Bill.
Yep.
My father's side, first of all, I'm the first person in our family to speak English as a first language,
No.
in spite of the fact that my grandparents and my dad were both born in the United States. They were from Maine, in the French Canadian part of Maine. My grandfather's grandfather was born in the States, and during the Civil War walked back to Canada when he was drafted, in response to the discrimination French Canadians were experiencing at that point. And then for some reason, my grandfather's parents came back. But our family, we can trace it back to 1604 at least in North America. My mom's family are Scottish, and she's third generation American.
Yeah. So I think,
I will just say I'm the exception, I believe, to the rule that immigrants kind of had tough when they came here, because my grandfather came here from Ireland when he was 15. His older sister was already here and married, and her husband owned a business of building houses in Squirrel Hill. So my grandfather had a place to live and a job and spoke English when he got here. So, yeah, I don't feel any sort of discrimination in that sense.
Yeah. So I think we all have sort of stories. I know in my family, when I was born in Arkansas. When I was 4, I moved to South America. When I was 8, I moved to Texas. When I was 16, I moved to Pittsburgh. When I was 18, I moved back to Texas. And when I was 22, I moved back to Pittsburgh. So, you know, and if you think about the reasons, most of them were related to my father's job working for Alcoa. So for economic reasons, we were moving around. So it's not uncommon, particularly whether for education or for, you know, a job, is the most common reason that we're moving around. But I think I also gained a lot of different experiences and a lot of different perspectives from living in all those places over those time frames. And I think that was kind of interesting. So the next thing we talked about in our class was sort of the reasons for why people migrate from place to place. And we were asked to think about what would it take for you to leave? So if you can imagine a family and they want to come to the United States, but they have to travel, let's say 3,000 or 4,000 miles. So what would it take somebody here to leave your family, leave your home, leave your assets, leave your friends, leave your job, leave your culture, and decide, I'm going to travel, take the risk. It's not just an easy travel. It's not like you're going to get on a plane and fly, but you're going to risk all kinds of things to go that 4,000 miles. So imagine that, let's say Brazil was this economic vital country and we were trying to go to Brazil. So what would it take for you to do that? And I think the idea was, can you put yourself in the shoes of those people who are doing that? We heard last week from Monica about this one family whose relatives, you know, were decapitated, and their heads were left on their porch as a warning to that family. And that's the kind of thing. So despite what you hear about jails emptying out, yes, there are criminals that are here, but the percentage of criminals is like 1/10 the number of criminals that we have in our own society just on its own. There's only the New York Times put out a thing where they did research on who makes up the 11 million or more immigrants that are here illegally. And there's only about, from their research, 400,000 criminals who are out of that 11 million. If you Google what's the percentage of Americans who have committed crimes, it's about 33% of adults have committed crimes in this country. So it's 3% compared to 33%. But anyway, the majority of the people are leaving circumstances in which they're facing things that are so bad that they're willing to take that risk to come to this country. So again, ponder in your mind, how bad would things have to get for you to pick up and leave, and maybe leave your family behind to go to somewhere else. So the major reasons really for migration, sort of on a positive side, would be economic opportunity. That if you look at where people are migrating from and where people are migrating to, it's usually to a place where there is some economic opportunity. In addition, there's a lot of hardships that are being placed on people, causing them to leave. So it could be war or political unrest. So like a lot of the people leaving Haiti, for instance, today are leaving because of the political chaos and the gangs sort of taking over parts of Haiti and leaving. We know, like with one of the groups that we're still working with, Hearts United with Haiti, they actually had to move their location in Haiti because the gangs had infiltrated and they got a note on their door saying, hey, if you don't pay us so much money, be careful. So famine. So if there's no food available, that's another major reason for people leaving. Gangs and drug-related violence, a lot of that going on in Central America and South America right now. Human trafficking, if people are threatening to take your children and then sell them off for money, you're looking for ways to escape. And then environmental changes. So if there's drought or fire or other things, hurricanes, climate change related to where your place where you live is so bad now, it's also forcing people to migrate to other areas that are more suitable for living. So lots of different reasons why people are migrating. I don't know if anybody has ever heard of the doctrine of discovery before. This was something new to me, and hearing about this maybe in such explicit detail. But the doctrine of discovery started with a pope in the Renaissance. So it was Pope Nicholas V. And basically, he was kind of looking to be on the good side of both the King of Portugal and the King of Spain. So Portugal at the time was the major naval and shipping leader in Europe because of their proximity on the west coast of Europe. And so I'm going to read this to you. This Pope issued two papal, they're called bulls. So sort of pronouncements from the Pope about things. And so the first one was in 1452, and this was written to King Alfonso of Portugal. And it says, the first one I'm going to read, the doctrine gives Portugal the right to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens. And Saracens, in this case, refers to Muslims. And pagans whatsoever, and other enemies of Christ, wheresoever placed, and the kingdoms, dukedoms, principalities, dominions, possessions, and all movable and immovable goods, whatsoever held and possessed by them, and to reduce their persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to himself and his successors the kingdoms, dukedoms, counties, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to his and their use and profit.
That sounds like a real Christian
Mhm.
philosophy.
Yeah.
So basically, the Pope gave the blessing to the King of Portugal to basically plunder Africa. And basically, this led then to the Portuguese going down to Africa, and basically anybody who wasn't a Christian was fair game to plunder all their activities. Then 2 years later, if that wasn't enough, there was another papal bull called Romanus Pontifex, which is essentially again reiterated the things in the first papal bull, telling them that if they didn't convert to Christianity, that you were able to again make them slaves. And so the king's son actually led sort of the efforts to basically they enslaved then all the African people that they encountered. So the Portuguese would go down and slave those folks and then sell them. So that was really the beginning of sort of the plunder of things in Africa and the start really of slave trade.
Well, it actually started before that. The doctrine of discovery was because Spain and Portugal were in conflict with one another over who gets to exploit Africa. And so he gave Africa to Portugal and told Spain they got everything from the Canary Islands west, which led to actually the Spanish actually pursuing going west. So they were already doing this. The doctrine was really to try to keep these two kingdoms from fighting with one another. So it's all Eurocentric, the whole reason for it.
Yeah.
But they were already they were initially focusing on sugar plantations to enslave people, but quickly it became apparent that there was a real economic prosperity in having trading people. Even.
So that actually leads to,
Alan,
yes,
if you just go by that doctrine and what it says, why couldn't people convert and keep their property and persons?
well, I'm sure there probably were some.
You could, and every one of their forays into Africa, they would actually have priests with them to try to convert. So conversion was, so some blacks were not prone to slavery. They converted those blacks and had them help to get more slaves from amongst the pagans. So that's why some Africans were involved in the slave trade with the Europeans, because they had been converted or they pretended to be converted because they saw an economic opportunity too, to get rid of some of their pesky neighbors. I think it's complicated. I guess I'm getting on a tangent here.
It's okay.
It's a long story.
Yeah,
So-
I was just reading a book about this.
So we can see here, this is what sort of to Phil's point about the Spanish and their conquest of, so not very long after the doctrine of discovery, you start to see the discoveries of Central and North America by the Spanish, and essentially the entire area of sort of Mexico, Central America, all those countries are controlled after various expeditions that led to the conquest of those areas. When I lived in Texas, I lived in a town called Port Lavaca, Port of the Cow, but it was named after Cabeza de Vaca, who was one of the explorers who came to that area of Texas and, was celebrated as an explorer, conquistador. In information that we were presented, they don't have exact numbers, so it's a fairly wide range, but they estimate that anywhere from 25 to 75% of the indigenous people in these areas were killed by the conquistadors who came. So we talked a lot about Central American history in our class to just kind of understand the background of the Catholic Church coming to Central America and sort of the good and bad parts of that occurred. Another part of our class was really talking about what should mission work be like and some of the histories of mission work. And it started at the early church, say from 0 to 400 AD. Mission work was basically sort of a grassroots kind of effort that was bubbling up following the death of Christ, where small collections and communities of Christians were looking to just spread the gospel. And so it was a very different approach to sort of talking about Christianity and sharing the mission of Christianity in those early years. So in 400, I don't know if anybody, maybe Phil, you know, in 400, yes, Constantine. Right, so when Constantine took power and Christianity became the official religion, things started to change. It became more, in some ways, a top-down kind of thing. And people were harmed in some ways if they weren't Christians. So missionaries at that point were going out to sort of spread the empire of various groups. And then in the 1500s, it's related to the colonization efforts. And so the mission efforts were there as sort of ambassadors of the colony to spread the word, but also reap wealth and also slavery. And I used a couple images from the movie The Mission that we watched, where there was one guy there, Robert De Niro at the bottom, who started the movie as a slave trader. And as the movie went on, he began to see sort of the harms of that and sort of went to the other side. And Jeremy Irons, who's in the top, was a priest who was actually very sympathetic to the indigenous people, was trying to protect them, and was actually killed in the movie trying to protect the indigenous people. And they did make a point of saying, you know, yes, while a lot of harm came, there was also, you know, good things in terms of education, hospitals, being able to read and write that came along with these things. So it's sort of a mixed history. You can't just say one without saying the other. But I think it was talking about, can we get back to more about how things were when the early church was, where you went alongside people more as helping and not so much as imposing what you think is right for them as the way you do mission work.
Well, it's like that book, When Things Fall Apart, about, anybody else read that? Missionaries go to Africa and it falls apart.
Another thing we talked about is being sensitive to cultural differences. We have, I think, you know, pride in our own countries, but sometimes that leads to thinking our way is the only way of doing things and our way is the best way of doing things. And we're going to go show people how to do things. And that can provide a lot of trouble. So we went through a lot of different methodologies for looking at sort of cultural differences, and that in mission work, there needs to be sensitivity to these cultural differences. So one was, you know, do you tend to make decisions in a community-based way or an individualistic-based way? And they had a scale sort of from one end to the other, more individualistic, more collectivist. And they would put different countries on that scale. In this particular case, the United States was at the far end of the individualistic kind of, you know, our ethos has been about, you know, self-sufficiency, et cetera, conquering the West and things like that. Others, but there are parts like the Quakers, for instance, even in our country, you know, they make decisions only once they reach sort of unanimous conclusion together. So they will debate back and forth until everybody agrees with one point of view, and then that's what they go forward with. And so that those kind of things exist even in our country, but in other countries, there is much more of a communal effort at coming to decisions about things. And so if you're working in a particular country, understanding where they fall in some of these categories helps to know, you know, what may be effective in terms of communicating with them, what may be effective in terms of bringing certain people in to help make decisions versus you sort of imposing your ideas on them. So, you know, we went through how do people deal with people in power? Are they, you know, in the United States, we're actually free to communicate. We can write letters. Other places, if you are in dissent, you may be in prison or you may be killed. So there's different degrees there. You know, we tend to be higher risk takers. And so that's led to lots of good things in our country. So anyway, just being sensitive to those things was an important way in which we looked at various cultural differences. They brought in a human rights attorney from Mexico to one of our classes. And we had a whole session on just talking about the perspective of human rights when it comes to immigration. One of the things that they pointed out is that in many cases, immigrants fall into sort of a political limbo. They're, are they really, they're from one country, they're in another country, which rules apply, who applies those rules, how do they apply those rules? And in many cases, they end up in sort of that political limbo, or they fall into very gray areas in which people can take advantage of sort of the unclear rules or lack of knowledge about the rules as to what actually goes on. The other thing that's taking place with immigrants who are coming to the United States is that depending on your country of origin may determine how long it takes for your legal asylum cases to be processed. So the average is 4 years, but countries from Central America maybe have 10, 12, 14-year waits. Other people may be coming from a country that is in favor with the current political government, may have their processes be sped up or expedited, but the average wait, even in a legal case, is 4 years. And that creates, families get split up in that time. People are taken advantage of in that time. What happens during that waiting period, it leads to a lot of issues. And there are all kinds of groups who will take advantage of that in terms of people will prey on particularly younger females in terms of, why you don't need to wait, that long. Come with me, I'll get you a job that can make you a lot of money, da 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 da. And after going through so many hardships, they say yes, and they end up in a sex trafficking or a drug trafficking. Many people are in detention camps and for long periods of time, not just like waiting a month before you move on to the next thing. You can be there. And so the point of this part of the class was just to what can be done in terms of addressing the human rights situation associated with immigration. They said their only thought for helping with this is a revolution within the church, that the church needs to be one stepping forward to rally around what's going on. So that was interesting, sort of their perspective on how it might be resolved is if the church rose up to create some kind of revolution. So if we look at the history of immigration in America, there's lots of different sort of time frames from which the immigration has occurred. So obviously when the colonization of America came, there was lots of people coming over to the United States from different countries, basically settling in the country. You had the expansion sort of after we became a country and sort of the move westward through the country, there was an expansion. And so more and more people were coming to the country. You had the African slave trade from the 1500s to the mid 1800s when the Civil War occurred. The Industrial Revolution was another major time when people were coming to the country. And then after World War II, just addressing concerns in other countries, people came. And essentially, most of these are driven by economics. There's sort of either a better life that you're going to come here, or the, say in the Industrial Revolution, with the expansion and the inventions here, there was the need for more and more labor. And obviously in the African slave trade, the entire economy of the South is based on free labor. And then, you know, how we can make a lot more money if you have everybody working at no cost really to you. So economics is really sort of the main driver for immigration at various different points in our country's history.
When did the terminology change from immigration to asylum seekers? Like why aren't we just using the term immigration now?
Well, asylum seekers are people who are coming here, but you have to have cause to seek asylum. You can't just come because I can get a better job here. You have to come because there's
Escaping.
there's distress in your country that's such a point that there are rules related to what constitutes an asylum case. And so there actually, you go before a judge and a judge reviews your case and your arguments to say, yes, you fall under the standard for seeking asylum, and we'll grant you asylum in our country. People who are coming with those reasons, though, are put on waiting lists partly because the government won't fund enough judges for them to go through the process. That's one of the tools that they use to slow things down, is basically saying, we're not going to appoint judges to hear asylum cases. And so you just wait in line and the line just keeps getting longer and longer. But there's a big difference between just, and asylum seekers are also, it's legal, it's a legal status that you're under. So it's not an illegal immigrant. So an asylum case would be a legal way to enter the country from another country.
But also speaking on the legal system, in 1965, there was a major reorganization of the immigration law. Because from the early 20th century until 65, there were national quotas. And the quotas were much smaller on, you can guess which countries would have smaller quotas. And that's in my lifetime, it's made an enormous change in my lifetime of who's coming and why.
And there still are quotas today. So you'll hear discussions about increasing or decreasing the number of quotas for different countries. So that still is in existence in terms of, you know, we will allow so many people from, say, Nepal to come to the country, or China or whatever. But
But
yeah,
they
so
were
that's,
very, very racially restrictive until Johnson administration.
yeah, and in the
And still
by the
has, of
50s
course,
and 60s, it was any communist country would have a
communists, yeah,
teeny tiny
other-
number, right?
other
And
reasons.
anybody fighting communism would have a bigger number, those kinds of things. So. And I guess a question that I think needs to be asked is, I think a lot of the discussion around immigration today is based on a model of scarcity. Like, these people are taking our things, these people are taking our jobs, these people are taking our resources, these people are using our resources, and it's a model of scarcity. And in fact, you know, a lot of the opposite is true. I can send out to the group an article about the taxes that illegal immigrants pay. I think a year or two ago, it was like $8 to $10 billion in taxes that they pay, either through sales taxes. A lot of them a lot of companies are not just paying everybody under the table in cash. Like if you're a large company, like say Purdue Chicken, you can't pay all those people under the table. So they actually have a system where immigrants establish an ITN. It's a tax identification number, a TIN. And if you're an illegal immigrant, you actually pay Social Security tax and other wage taxes of which you cannot receive any benefits. So contrary to what is being said, these people are paying billions into the system and can't reap anything in return. So, and I think the other thing is that I think if people will talk with you honestly, there's been some articles in the paper, even in the past week, about the need for immigrants here in Pittsburgh. That the only reason Pittsburgh's population didn't decline in the last census was because more immigrants came to Pittsburgh. They, in where Casa San Jose is in Beachview, those neighborhoods were boarded up. They've created a new vibrant downtown. They're paying property taxes. They're maintaining the housing stock. They're obviously purchasing things to live. And so the economic benefit. And my brother-in-law works for one of the major banks, and they've done studies looking at sort of the population decline in the country based on people having fewer kids. And they've determined that the only way that we can sustain our gross domestic product into the future is by having more immigrants, not less immigrants. So I think, there's a lot of different sides to this story, and sometimes we only hear sort of the ones that are trying to make people afraid. But there's really a lot of things going on in the country where we need to be looking at it more out of an operation of abundance rather than scarcity.
Alan,
Yes, go ahead.
if I may, just to interject a comment, I wonder if we might agree to use the term undocumented rather than illegal. And I'm coming from the standpoint that as children of God, human beings are not illegal in and of themselves. They can be undocumented in a certain country or whatever. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good point. Thank you. So then we kind of finished up our course talking about the biblical perspective related to immigration. And there's 3 Bibles here and 2 there that are marked with some passages. I don't know if if anybody is interested in reading a passage, we can pass those around. But obviously there have been a lot of great migrations in the Bible, right? So you have Abraham going to Egypt, you have Joseph and his family migrating to Egypt, and then you have the Exodus out of Egypt. So all very familiar stories with regard to, migration that's taking place. And then in the Old Testament, it's interesting that immigrant or stranger kind of appears in the Old Testament 92 times. It talks about various aspects of how do we treat strangers. So a couple that I highlighted, who has Leviticus 19:33 and 34?
I have that.
Do you want to read that, Brian?
Sure. When the alien resides with you in your land, you shall not oppress the alien. The alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God.
So this was a passage that has like a series of parts like that, where it talks about treating other people and doing other things. So it's sort of a kind of a list of rules for moral holiness. And included in that is this passage about how we should, accept and treat the stranger. Who has the Deuteronomy passage?
What is it?
10, 12, it's on your little piece of paper too.
Oh. Okay. You want me to read that whole thing?
Sure.
So now, O Israel, what does the Lord your God require of you? Only to fear the Lord your God, to walk in all his ways, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to keep the commandments of the Lord your God and his decrees that I am commanding you today for your own well-being. Although heaven and the heaven of heavens belong to the Lord your God, the earth with all that is in it, yet the Lord set his heart in love on your ancestors alone, and chose you, their descendants after them, out of all the peoples as it is today. Circumcise then the foreskin of your heart, and do not be stubborn any longer. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who is not partial and takes no bribe, who executes justice for the orphan and the widow, and who loves the strangers, providing them food and clothing. You shall also love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall fear the Lord your God, him alone you shall worship. To him you shall hold fast, and by his name you shall swear. He is your praise, he is your God, who has done for you these great and awesome things with your own eyes have seen. Your ancestors went down to Egypt 70 persons, and now the Lord your God has made you as numerous as the stars in heaven.
I thought this was an interesting passage. I wanted the longer part to be read because it has ties to like Micah. It has ties to Paul. It has ties to sort of the great commandment of loving your neighbor and loving God. So there was a lot in that particular passage in Deuteronomy, but also just sort of an overall, remembrance of where did you come from? Was I with you when you went there? Was I with you when you returned? Did I provide for you when you came back? And all those things sort of wrapped up into, and there's a lot more examples, of where those similar kinds of thoughts are expressed, in the Old Testament. So I don't know if anybody has any questions or comments about that. And then if we go to the New Testament, so there's lots of images of Jesus himself being a migrant. So obviously when he was born, traveling for the census, fleeing to Egypt just after he was born, and then basically, where was Jesus's home during his ministry? He was really an itinerant preacher going from place to place to place to place. And so let's see, there's also a lot of things that Paul wrote about being unified together. And so maybe we could, whoever has Ephesians 2:11-22, we could read that one first.
Yeah. Okay. So then, remember that at one time you Gentiles by birth, called the uncircumcision by those who are called the circumcision, a physical circumcision made in the flesh by human hands. Remember that you were at that time without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. But now, in Christ, you who were once far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. For he is our peace. In his flesh, he has made both groups into one,
and has broken down the dividing wall, that is, the hostility between us. He has abolished the law with its commandments and ordinances, that he might create in himself one new humanity in place of two, thus making peace, and might reconcile both groups to God in one body through the cross, thus putting to death that hostility through it. So he came and proclaimed peace to you who were far off, and peace to those who were near. For through both of us, for through him, both of us have access in one spirit to the Father. So then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are citizens with the saints, and also members of the household of God, built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Christ alone himself as the cornerstone. In him, the whole structure is joined together and grows into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you also are built together spiritually into a dwelling place for God.
So this is sort of Paul's argument related to the Jews and the Gentiles of coming together as one, and that people who are disparate from each other actually have Christ in common, and Christ is sort of the uniting body between all of those. And it actually harkens back to that previous passage, again, when they talked about the circumcised and the uncircumcised together. Okay, who has the Hebrews?
Let brotherly love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares.
So, yeah, just a sort of a good reminder that you never know who you're offering goodwill to. So I like that one a lot. And then I thought we might finish with the story of the Good Samaritan. I'm not sure who has that one.
That one's here too. Someone else want to read it?
You did well.
So, as we're, this is obviously a very familiar story to all of us, but in light of sort of the discussion that we've had over the last couple of weeks, think about it again in terms of the immigrant and what it's saying about the immigrant and the whole theology of neighbor.
Just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he said, what must I do to inherit eternal life? He said to him, what is written in the law? What do you read there? He answered, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And he said to him, you have given the right answer. Do this and you will live. But wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? Jesus replied, a man was going down to Jerusalem from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near, and when he saw him, he was moved to pity. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay you whatever more you spend. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? He said, the one who showed him mercy. Jesus said to him, go and do likewise.
So I think, I don't know, for me, what I hear is in some ways similar to, Jesus's call about following me, and so in that story is like, are we going and doing likewise? And I think that was sort of the point they were trying to make in terms of dealing with immigrants. And those who are, maybe not from here. How do you show that neighborliness? How can you be a better neighbor, etc. And forget about distinctions, forget about boundaries, forget about whatever, but how can you assist the neighbor? So that's kind of where we ended our first semester of our class. So in the sort of the curriculum for what we have coming forward, we're going to talk about how has faith led people to be involved in this. So we're going to look at faith-driven change makers. We're going to look at various strategies for coming alongside in mission with the immigrant population and what sort of tools there might be. We're going to have some description of El Salvador and things that migrants are doing in their country. And then they're going to come up with steps and commitments that we can bring back to our churches for ways how we might be able to move forward. So maybe in April or May, when our course is over, we could have another session and kind of go through kind of what came out of all of that in terms of action steps that congregations might be able to take to do more to be more neighborly to folks. So anyway, that's sort of where our course has taken us so far, kind of the things that we've learned, and some of the perspectives that have been presented to us in our course. So I don't know if anybody else has any other questions.
That was a good presentation, Alan.
Yeah, thank you. Very good. Excellent.
I'd be curious if in the next session you learn, I don't know this at all. What does it take for a company to sponsor immigrants? And what are the roadblocks to that isn't? Is it expensive? Is it a legal process? I mean,
H-1B visa.
Yeah, so our architecture firm actually hired probably four or five people who came on H-1B visas. So they come to the United States as a student from a different country, and then they can apply for H-1B status. So it's a different status, it's a government form, it's H-1B, right? And so they have to find employment of somebody who would sponsor them. And there is a whole process, like legally, we had to pay an attorney to draft up forms, and you commit to keeping them employed. And if one of you terminates that, there are consequences financially, potentially, or they have to find another job with somebody else who will sponsor their H-1B. So it's good for 3 years, and it can be renewed for another 3 years. So they have 6 years, in which case they're trying to get their green card if they can to stay permanently. We had one woman who was on an H-1B who she decided to go back to China and live again in China. So she went back to her country of origin. Another woman who was Chinese ended up marrying a man from the United States. And so she gained status that way by marrying a US citizen. We had another person, trying to think which country she was from. She was from might have been Pakistan. She was working in Iowa and wanted to move to Pittsburgh. And so we had to pay money to allow her to come to our firm. And then you have to pay certain fees for her as well. And also then there are consequences if she leaves or doesn't leave. So it's sort of a joint commitment to allow them to come and work here in the United States. So a lot of people, who are coming, and they're talking about, you want to invite people who are bright people, talented people to be in our country because they produce innovation, add all kinds of advantages into the economy. And so certain people are allowed. Now, during that process, they were nervous, like when their 3 years are coming up, they're not sure if they can be renewed. So there was a lot of angst amongst those people, like, is my visa gonna be renewed or am I gonna be forced to go back? In our case, the people that we had, and we put binders of information trying to support their cause as to why they should stay. So the companies had a lot of, we had a lot invested in them and vice versa. But we were fighting for them to try to stay to get that extra 3 years, for them to be here. So that was at least our experience with the H-1B visa program.
So that would be a
Especially-
lot of work for someone who might have a landscaping business
Yeah.
with 50 employees who are not necessarily student, passing through.
Yeah, they wouldn't really
Yeah,
have
you
come
have
through
to
it.
establish that they have unique skills or characteristics that aren't available in other American workers. And so a lot of what people pay immigration lawyers to do is to write job descriptions that they sort of reverse engineer it. If I know that I'm going to invite somebody from China, then I want to say that I'm looking for an architect who speaks Chinese and has these particular skills, and there's no other American like that.
I had to do that to keep a college professor in our department who was from Canada, too. Just to demonstrate that he had unique skills that we were having trouble hiring otherwise. Or to keep him on board.
Yeah, you're
Right,
talking
yeah,
about,
that really
isn't there, are
applies.
there temporary,
Right, talking about
for
Yeah.
people
people,
working in the, like Purdue
right?
or not the highly educated.
I
That's
don't
the
know.
problem.
That's.
Jim has a question or comment.
I guess I'm caught from, feel like I'm getting hit by this issue from so many different directions. I don't know which way to turn. Most directly, two experiences. We took a vacation in Maine in 2019. And on a Sunday morning, we're driving up through Maine. And out of the BBC, out of Boston Public Radio, they had a symposium, a panel on what's the cause of immigration. And the representatives on that panel were from, I can remember, Nicaragua, Guatemala, Mexico, and there were a couple others. Some were business people, some were clergy people, and some were governmental people. And then we actually pulled off the car and sat and listened to it because it was quite good. And finally, a woman who was a minister of something, not a religious minister, but a governmental minister from Guatemala said, "You're not going to solve this problem. It's crazy. Just not going to solve it until you wipe out governmental corruption on both sides of the border.
Good luck.
You won't solve it." So that was one experience. The other experience was just this Christmas Eve. I went to, and I told this to somebody, I went to a Christmas Eve service at the Bethel Baptist Church on Roswell Road outside of Atlanta. And this church is quite amazing. They had 6 Christmas Eve services.
Wow.
Their sanctuary seats 2,000, and they're all packed to standing room only. And they have just gotten a new minister. And he's a little coarse around the edges, and the people don't know how to kind of handle him yet. And he said, he started off with the trip that Joseph and Mary were caused to take to migrate. and the trip that the three kings took to see the Christ child. And he said, you have to think about trips, migration. He said, think about this, if you want to relate it to you as an individual. We're sitting here, and Atlanta, Georgia is the center for child trafficking in the United States of America. The road out front connects to the Delk Road interchange on I-95. At that interchange are 5 motel complexes with 200 and 300 rooms in them because it's a big convention center area. That interchange is a center for child trafficking in the United States. What are you going to do about it? Think about that. 1 interchange away, 2 miles away, all that we hear about child trafficking and what they must face as individuals that make that trip you're talking about. So you're getting this from all areas. You don't know what's right and wrong. You don't know how can we deal with it. We need the migrant workers, that's pretty well established. But how do you take a problem this big apart to deal with the component parts in a manageable way? I hope that you folks get to something like that. Not that you'll come up with the ultimate solution.
I'm just struck by how our country's rhetoric right now on immigration is, it could not be more polar opposite of the Good Samaritan. It's not, it's just like the absolute opposite.
I'm reading The Grapes of Wrath right now. You should hear about that migration.
Yeah.
Whoa. How bad we were.
But like, where is the church? Where is the church? You mentioned about the revolution, the church. How are we talking about immigration in the way we are today, when the Good Samaritan is one of our foundational stories? Like, that just doesn't jive to me.
Trying to get more people to do it. One of the stories that one of my classmates came back with from the border, they just did this 10-day trip to the US-Mexico border. One of my close friends met a gentleman who had paid, which is apparently fairly common, had promised to pay $15,000 to the cartels to bring him across the border, because there really are no other good ways for, and it was one of those situations. He needed a job, he needed to support his family, he knew that there were jobs he could get here in chicken factories and all these other places. So the structure of this is he had to pay $1,000 up front, and then he would come over here and he would owe the rest of the cartel, but he would work and he would pay it. 3 days after he got here, he was picked up by US Border Control, deported back to Mexico. And so now he owes $14,000 to the cartels with no job. He can't go anywhere because they have, the way the cartels have set things up is it's not Juarez or Tijuana, but another one of the border cities. They're sort of prevented from leaving, and that's the situation that they're in. And this is apparently very common.
There was a news report on television. To your point, we tend to think of us and them, the immigrants, us and them. There was a man from the Border Patrol who testified in front of Congress the other day about the importation of fentanyl. He said, what you're not realizing, the Mexicans, it comes through Mexico, and the Latinos and the Mexicans get it across the border. But you, as citizens, distribute it. It's not an us and them. It's a collective
we are contributing to the problem.
We're doing it ourselves. That shocked me.
Yeah, that's an interesting point to make. Well,
It's good
Thank you.
presentation, Alan.
Yeah.
yeah,
Very well done.
so,
Continue with your course.
Sounds like a really good
Yeah.
course. Yeah.
yeah, it's been good. So, and you get a lot of good perspectives
Yeah.
from folks from other countries. So, okay, thanks.
Thank you, sir. Very well done.